Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today.
Well, my assumption is there are things you want to do that you cannot do. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. For what I hate, I do. He says, now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin living in me. And so I want to talk about where this problem, where this root, power, force, cancer inside of us ultimately originates. And when Adam sinned, sin entered the world. Adam's sin brought death, so death spread to everyone, for everyone, sin. But there's a great difference between Adam's sin and God's gracious gift. He says, for if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? And he says the alternative operating system is Christ. Well, this may not seem fair, but it's true. How grateful should we be that this also is not fair, but it's true.
So I wanted to ask you how it is going living with Miss Sandy.
I mean, what can I say on a public podcast other than great? I mean, it really is. I told her that too, like Sunday afternoon. I was like, hey, there's this joke on there. I'm using you for laughs are coming at your expense type thing, but just know we feel really grateful, really safe, really appreciative. Like, it's a great location. She's just so sweet. I mean, everybody that knows Sandy, she made a steak Sunday night, and we have her room. We have the master suite, and she was like, no, I don't want you to go upstairs with Mowgli. I'm like, no, we will go upstairs with. And she's like, no. It's just honestly, it's easier on me if you just y'all have this part of the house, and we're like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
So she's so great that way, and
it is a lot closer. I mean, you're enjoying the benefit of that
100%
for a minute, right?
Yeah. I mean, I left the house and got to Northpoint in 5 minutes on Sunday morning, and I was like, dang, that's cool,
Yeah.
Not that 20 minutes is crazy from Georgetown, but you felt the difference. It was like, man, this is nice. So yeah, it's been great, and she's super generous, and partly because we're like, hey, we don't know exactly what the end date is. It's just cool that we have that, and and it's really good. So, and
being a runner, I mean, you can run outside her front door and get to Brushy pretty quickly, right?
Creek is super accessible right
How
there.
far away is that?
It's like a quarter mile. I mean, it's like
wow.
You just go down Gupton. And I mean, based on your entry point, if you want to, I guess, to actually enter the trails a little bit further than that.
Right.
But, yeah, all of that is great. We felt that temptation a little bit, because I think when you're in Georgetown, you're like, oh, this isn't bad at all. 20 minutes, especially when there's no traffic. I thought it was so much further. But then now we're living here, for the week, and we're like, dang, this location is nice. So
for sure,
it's definitely a benefit.
That is one of the things that's funny, because us living out in Liberty Hill, it's we're 20 minutes away from everything, we feel like, because most of the things we do are not actually in Liberty Hill.
Yeah.
And it takes 5 minutes to get out of our neighborhood, and we just find that it's wherever we go, even going in somewhere in Austin because of toll road access and stuff, wherever we go, it's 20, 25 minutes away.
Right. Yeah. And it is what people get used to. I mean, you're in Chicago, and you're like, yeah, I just drive an hour each way to work every day. And that's just what you're used to,
Yeah, it's crazy.
So people, but I'm like, dang, the 5 minutes to whatever we want, even Gold's in the morning. I mean, it's just it's a great spot.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And she's been great.
How people did this before Audible blows my mind.
Yeah, true.
Because that's one of the benefits of having a longer commute.
Right.
For me, I love listening to books, and so I just get to plow through a lot of books with a longer commute. But I think about not having that going, man.
Yeah.
You just sit with your thoughts.
I know.
What?
It's crazy. I don't know how people did it.
Yeah. I'll never forget, actually, because I am one of those weird people that likes to drive in silence sometimes. And I'll never forget when you did like a welcome host or something, and then you were like, raise your hand if you're a psychopath that likes to like sit in silence in the cars. Do you remember this?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know what's funny is this elderly gentleman came up to me after church on Sunday, and he just said like 2 lines. He said, hey, I'm from out of town. I'm not here that often. But today you hold me out of a problem, and last time you called me a psychopath because I listened to the radio in the car or something like that. And he like walked out the door, and I was like, great to talk to you. I think he was joking. I don't think he was mad, but it was like kind of funny. He's like, 2 times I've heard you speak. He said, I got a problem and I'm a psychopath. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, sir. That's not what I meant.
That is funny. That is funny. You did start us off with this new series we're in called Set Free this week. And we're asking this big question, why do I do what I do? And the really cool thing is we're not the only ones to ask this question. Paul, the Apostle Paul, asked this in the book of Romans 2,000 years ago. And he said, why do I do what I do? Why, I keep on doing the things I don't want to do. And you kind of unpacked this whole passage, and we're kind of jumping around in Romans 7 and 8 and 5 throughout this series, really pulling apart this dynamic that we all experience, in which we do things sometimes that we can't explain why we do them, and we're not able to stop them sometimes, or we're not able to start the things that we want to start as well. And so I want to jump into some of this content here. This series being all about being set free, sometimes we have things in our life that we don't want to see that have a hold on us. And so what would you say would be the reasons or indicators that might lead us to see something that we need to see because it's important, it's hurting us, or we need to start seeing something different, but we haven't been willing to see yet? Yeah. What are the things that would lead us to seeing with eyes wide open?
Yeah, I mean, there's like an art to being honest with yourself, right? So I think, I mean, my default would be, who are like the people who are in proximity, like closest to you, like who are the people who are with you the most? I think, if you are married, if you have children, your coworkers or a roommate or a best friend, like if you were to just ask the question, I mean, it's an age-old question that Buck's challenged us with, for a decade now, but like, what's it like on the other side of me? With somebody you have like established trust with, who has your best in mind. They're not just going to like, just complain for the sake of complaining or project their insecurities on you or whatever.
Right.
I think that's like one of those indicators that, man, like it, I don't know how to explain this exactly, but my like ability to listen, I think over the last decade, I think especially since being married, but it's like there's this assumption to me now, like when somebody's reflecting feedback to me, like there's at least something there to like not dismiss almost anybody. It doesn't, like some people give you bad feedback and they give you, but just generally speaking, like what are they trying to say? What's the emotion behind what it is that they're trying to communicate, right? So that's like one indicator to me. I've had most of my aha or most of my blind spot moments or most of like, I never saw that, like came from somebody reflecting something to me. And they were a person that, I had a relationship with or trust with, and I just couldn't see it, So I feel like that is one of my, or like one of the go-tos. I do think time with God is another like really convicting spot for me. So I just think if that's a habit that you have, or if you're striving to make it one, and it's all the time, I come across a verse and there's a little bit of that like gut punch, a little bit of that, oh man, like that's me. Like I'm who Paul is warning against. I'm who like, and so I think there's plenty of things there that it's a little bit of like a mirror. It's a little bit of like a, I've been coasting or I haven't thought about that in a while, or maybe you just never, heard that. I also do think there are indicators, that I referenced the numbing a lot this week, but I think that's something that's really interesting to pay attention to. If you have like a high percentage of your day given to numbing, so if you look at your screen time report and it's hours on there, if you're like, drinking is a part of my daily rhythm, and that's I'm not saying you can't have a glass of wine each night. But like, if you're like, it's gotta be, you know what I mean? Or else, any of those kinds of, if shopping is a continuous, point of tension with you or your spouse, like if there's something where like it's there's something behind that, that like those habits, that are like covering things are pointing to it. And I think it's such a nuanced conversation there, because the things I just listed are not bad. I'm not saying get them all out of your life. I'm not saying you like have so much guilt and conviction about like these normal everyday activities, but they do, they point to something, right? There is a something underneath that we're trying to feel different. We're trying to experience different. We're trying to not have to sit and think about. I do think it's interesting if it's hard for somebody to drive in a car in silence, you know?
Yeah.
I made fun of you for it, but like if that's like, no, I need noise. Like I can't be with me.
Yeah.
There's an indicator, right? I think that's your question. Like
Yeah.
there's something pointing there. So
yeah. No, I mean, just spending time with God, going back to that one, I think is so important because in the presence of perfection, the Almighty, in the presence of God, we are going to have a better perspective on our imperfections, and we're going to see more clearly. We're going to go, oh yeah, here's where I do fall short. I would also add, you and I have been in student ministry for quite a while, or we've been on the other side of students. You were in student ministry. You get what I'm trying to say. And one of the questions when it comes to, everybody knows at some point in student ministry, the sex message happens, right? And it's, hey, you got these feelings and we're going to help unpack these, and it's everyone's favorite Sunday of the year. And, but it's funny with the guys because when we start really breaking down, okay, relationships and here's why and all this, the question that often pops up is not like, how can I be more free sexually?
Yeah.
The question is, hey, how far can I get before I cross a line? How far can I go with this girl, or how far can I go with this thing before it becomes sin? And I think that's a really, that's a funny example to think about, but at the same time, it is an important one to notice because those are the types of questions we ask when maybe something has a hold on us. We go, well, how far can I get to the line? How far can I go before I actually break a rule?
Yeah.
And that's a very religious way of thinking versus a relationship with Jesus, going like, how can I be so in tune with Jesus, so in tune with God, and allow him to kind of work out the things in me. Right?
100%. Yeah. 100%. I think it's a great way of phrasing that.
So what would you say to people who are thinking, well, I don't really have anything relevant in my life as it relates to this series? You're sitting there talking about being set free from something, and they're going like,
Yeah.
I don't really have anything to be set free from. What would
Yeah.
you say to that group of people?
Well, just like, kind of raw, authentic for me is like, I really wish I knew what percentage of the room that was. Like because part of me, I'm like, is that anybody? Like, do we all have a thing if we're willing to sit with ourselves? Or is that half the room? Like, is it like, I almost wanted to do like one of those poll things and just be like, hey, is there something on your mind? When we just went through that huge start or stop list, like something you want to stop, something you want to start, did everybody have something, or were half of you like,
Yeah.
Like, I would just be so curious to know. I feel like the answers we just gave to question one are relevant to that. I mean, I think those things are going to kind of unearth, some things. But, I think this is a good question because there's a little bit of a double-edged sword to this, and you and I were kind of talking about this ahead of time. If you have there's a blaring struggle, like what it is, right? It is alcohol, it's pornography. I, find myself screaming at the people I love most. Like, where does that anger come from? Like, there's something you're wrestling with.
It's
right?
habitual.
Right, yeah. It's habitual. It has energy for you. You feel shame around it, whatever it might be. I don't know whether to call that a blessing or what, because that feels like weird language, but the positive side of that is it does point you to Christ. Like it makes it very obvious, like your need for help, your need for a savior. Like you see it, especially if you've been struggling with whatever that thing may be for any length of time, right? So there's this kind of awareness, like you're a little bit nodding along more in part one, like I get it, that's me, I've been trying to work on this. And there's like something good about that in terms of like you get to the posture of I need help quicker.
Yep.
And then there are people, and perhaps it's just people not being authentic, but I think there are like personality types where it's difficult to point to like a major thing. Like, this is the struggle of my life. This is the thing that damages all my relationships, And I think that while I'm not saying, man, I wish everybody just had this glaring sin they're always struggling with, the flip side of that is there can be a kind of like lukewarm approach to that. Like, I'm fine. Like, I'm a good person. Like, I sometimes I, make a joke I shouldn't make, or I'm a little selfish, or I get in a bad mood, but like, there's not like this thing,
Right.
And I think the danger of that can be like, it's sometimes harder to see your need for a savior. It's harder to see like you just equally for you as the person who has a blatant, like clear struggle, like it's just manifesting itself different. But there is what we talked about. There is something in you that's stronger than you. There's something in you that's trying to sabotage you, and I would be really concerned about wanting to, get to the bottom of that. There's a C.S. Lewis quote that I thought was relevant to this question, and maybe it seems like out of left field, but he said, Christianity if false is of no importance, and if true is of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important, right? So it's either like pointless or it's worth giving our whole lives to. And so if it feels like Christianity has become like, I've modified my behavior. My behavior is pretty good. And it's like one of the things that I do.
Yeah.
It's like, no, like maybe there's a little bit of even it's an omission thing. Like I should be way more intentional with my neighbors. I should be sharing the gospel more. I should be inviting to church. I should be giving radically. I should be, that may be the next step for you, that it's not necessarily this holding back, but have you engaged in the adventure of faith? Like, have you given your life to Christ, Yep. And as soon as you start doing that, you're going to run into something, like something's going to unearth. Like you'll be face to face with, your own selfishness or your own limitations or your own insecurities, like absolutely. So I think you can only kind of not see it if you're coasting. I don't, is that too strong to say or judgmental to say? That's the only thing. I don't know if that was too all over the place. If that
No,
makes sense,
that makes sense. And I think it, maybe the question for somebody sitting on the other side of this series going like, I don't know what it is for me, is like, what area in your life, maybe you've chosen to follow Jesus in some areas, but maybe you're making Jesus follow you in some other areas, and you're not quite willing to give over this aspect to him. And is there a sin? Is there an omission thing happening there? And if so, what does it look like to become free from whatever that is?
Yeah.
There's an artist I love listening to. His name is Chris Renzema, and we sing, I think, one of his songs at Northpoint, so perhaps people have heard his music before. But he's got this one song called Hard Drugs, and it's basically a whole song that's about, like, he's taking the hard stuff. And you think by the title of the song, he's talking, like, cocaine and, like, all this, but he's like, no, the hard drugs are greed and anxiety and pride and fear and shame. And he said, these are the drugs that have a hold of me.
Yeah.
And I thought that the song really brings to light for me, like, oh my gosh, sometimes they're the things that are, like, under the surface driving that we're, like, addicted to in a way that we need to become free from.
Right. Yeah.
I
think that's great. I love that. And there's culturally, there's interesting ones, right? Like there are still some patterns or behaviors that even culturally are kind of frowned upon, right? But then there's other ones like I both love and am curious about, like, the conversation around anxiety, right? Like, to some degree, I love how normalized. I love that people can speak about it. I love that it's okay to not be perfect. Like, I love that it's, I think even more with our generation, okay to get help, right?
Yep.
And sometimes it's spoken about almost as like a badge of honor. Like, I struggle with anxiety. It's always going to be that way. I remember talking to a friend not too long ago saying, like, hey, this has been, like, as long as I've known you, and, like, I'm not even from a judgmental place, but do you picture a less anxious version of yourself in the future? Like, is that a world, like, is there a way that you're trying to trust God with that? Or are you just like, nah, that's me. That's part of my personality. Like, I like this type of food. I like these sports, and I'm anxious. Like, and it's, even those can be things to be like, okay.
Yeah. Even do you distinguish between what causes you anxiety and what's just difficult?
Right.
Because sometimes that's what I've noticed, especially with Gen Zers, I think that's the right. Is that Is I've bumped into that in a couple conversations where it's like, hey, was that just, like, hard?
Yeah.
And, like, that's the word that we've now ascribed to that, is, like, that's anxiety when something is, like, difficult and uncomfortable. That's not to minimize, but I think you make a great point. Is, like, there are some cultural things, that we bump into for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about focusing on the correct problem, and there are multiple analogies here. And the one you used I loved is, like, it's like finding out we have cancer and taking ibuprofen, or it's like putting a Band-Aid on a flesh wound. It's like, okay, there's a symptom, and then there's a root cause, the underlying problem. And what so often happens is we tend to tackle the root cause, the disease, with these, like, symptom fixers. And so one of the most clear examples, you could think about, I don't know, an alcoholic or something going like, well, I'm not going to really dive into that, but I'm just going to basically, like, move away from all the bars I can, and maybe that'll fix it. Or I think about someone struggling with pornography. Well, I'm just going to put, like, a filter. And those are not bad things. Like, those are things we can do, but what then happens is it doesn't deal with perhaps something deeper going on. And so the question here is, why do we tend to focus on the wrong problem?
Yeah.
And what are the implications of us focusing on the wrong problem?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I probably didn't do a good job of explaining on Sunday too that, like, typically those two things are done in tandem, right? So to your point, those aren't bad things. Like, you go to a doctor and they are going to try to get the fever down first, as they're dealing with what's the core of this thing causing the fever, right? So of course, a lot of those things are good. I think, I was wondering, is there one answer to this question, or are there like multiple, just
facets, layers of it?
Yeah. Cause I think like one of the layers is it's just the most like blaring. So it becomes the obvious enemy or target, like this becomes the source of my pain. I do think it's the alcohol. I do think it's the outbursts. I do think it's the pornography. I don't even know, like perhaps it's, kind of like Paul says, don't you know, like we didn't even know that there was something underlying causing that. So we really demonized that thing. Right. And then it goes back to like a more religious mindset, like you mentioned earlier, of if I can fix all of these problems, then my life will be great. Like my relationships will be great. God will love me, perhaps, and so we kind of elevate or lift the problem without even realizing that there's a symptom underneath. I mean, sometimes when things are real out of control, like obviously, yeah, it almost is like the starting point is a little bit of a symptom. And like if you're bleeding out, like you've got to bandage like the wound, we got to like make sure you live, like we got to make sure you're okay. And so sometimes it's like, man, step one might be a little bit of like, let's get the symptoms under control, because to get to the root cause is going to take a while, based on your story, based on the barriers that are kind of in the way of you connecting with Christ and so on. Like sometimes that's going to be a long season where you're diving into the root cause. So we've got to do some symptom management in between. But I mean, I think the heart of it really has to do with more of it's the age-old problem of, trying to earn my way, to right standing with God or like accepting his grace. And I think we all struggle with that, even if we don't have that language. I'm going to make myself enough. Like I'm going to be good enough. So even if you don't think about earning God's approval, it's somebody's approval, it's your approval. There's a grass is greener. There's this greater version of you that you've got to work to and arrive. And that temptation, I think, is just in the wiring of all of us. I explained it on Sundays. I think we've inherited it from Adam, like it's in us. Versus like to be open-handed is counterintuitive. Like it's counterintuitive to say, stop fighting the thing that has a grip on you. That's not like natural. It's not logical to us. So I think that's one of the reasons that we do it as well. I think, based on your church experience, I mean, the church has, probably some responsibility here, because sometimes we way over focus on the behaviors, and there's this lifting up of people with good behaviors, and then it's like a total miss, like of, what the root cause and problem is in the first place. So, we boost our own egos, are feeling good. I've got a streak, I haven't drank in this amount of time, or, I haven't, had an outburst in this amount of time. And we're just focused on, we've elevated. I think it's literally possible to turn your problem into an idol, like, putting it above God. My real God is now just being free of this thing, versus surrendering control. So it just feels better a lot of times to focus on the problem than it does to surrender and give up control.
Yeah. So. And I would say, this goes into our next question a little bit, but sometimes focusing on the underlying root cause problem forces us to look in the mirror in a way we've never done before. Forces us to come to terms with maybe some ways that we were raised, or some things that our parents did, and we never realized it affected us in a certain way that causes us to maybe go to this thing now today. And so there's layers that are far more uncomfortable that we have to go to sometimes. And so it's easier to avoid them by focusing on the symptoms, right? I think sometimes that can happen. And I want to dive into this for just a second, but you could call this thing like generational sin. It is one of those Adam type sins. You could say Adam created a generational sin in all of us, but generational sin would be specific to like one's own family. So many times in our own families, there are behaviors or things or ways of seeing the world or biases or something like that, that can get passed down. What would you say generational sin is? How can you describe that? How does that relate to kind of what our discussion today?
Yeah, well, this gets complicated because there's like kind of a biblical and then like a cultural, right? Like there's some things that are almost easier for us to understand, and like my dad struggled with that, and now I see that in me. Like my mom struggled with that, now I see it in me, right? where there's when you examine your own family tree, there's some wild patterns. Sometimes that you'll see a pattern of divorce or a pattern of abuse of something. And there's this like understanding both. From a spiritual perspective, but even from like a psychological perspective, even a biological sometimes, that these things are quite literally passed down. And I think some of that is like, there's a genetic element, there's a spiritual element, there's a behavioral of like, your parents did what they saw their grandparents doing, and now they're doing the same things with you. And now you're repeating some of those, patterns and behaviors. Yep. So it's common for those to pass down. And we understand there needs to be like a fundamental break. A lot of times we talk about that being Christ, right? Entering into the dynamic, but a fundamental break if I'm not going to continue this pattern, in my family history and so on. When it comes to like the biblical concept, it's like, okay, now we understand like sin has passed down. It's almost, maybe it'd be easier to think about Adam as your great great grandfather as opposed to your great to the whatever X multiplier grandfather, because he feels a little bit farther away and harder to understand. But if you were to say like, no, it's that same kind of concept, and as a result, sin has been like building as a result, like we've inherited that from him. So, and you see some like, practical examples of this, in the Old Testament, like you see, Abraham lying about who his wife is. No, she's my sister. And then his son doing the exact same thing. You're like, what the heck? That's such a weird, nuanced like example of somebody, repeating the exact same sin.
Well, and then going on it too, when you get all the way down to the line of Joseph, there's this amazing scene with Jacob and Esau, and Joseph sees something and sees forgiveness happen. And, and then you get all the way down to Joseph and his decisions that he makes. Not to, we can't get into the whole story right now, but it's an amazing one to read if anybody hasn't read it yet. But just the way he says, like, I'm not going to do that. Like he stands in the face of like something that's been passed down in a way of behaving or a way of like seeking retribution. And then he goes, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to choose to do something differently. And that's like that break in generational sin.
100%.
You see in the Bible for sure.
And I think the takeaway of it, I mean, that was very brief. Like we could talk, that's a big kind of theological concept and all that.
100%.
But I think like the takeaway is not, I'm a victim of my, there's nothing I can do. I've like inherited that. I don't think that's the takeaway, but I think the takeaway is to realize I am going, like I'm kind of destined, if you will. The likelihood is high that I'm going to repeat a lot of these same things, repeat a lot of these patterns and behaviors, unless, we move towards a solution next week in part 2. We implement what we're going to be talking about, throughout this series. And that's helpful because otherwise you might be able to lie to yourself and just, I'm different. I'm assuming I'm different, and as like, okay, but can you point to why? Can you point to what has set you free? Because if you can't, like, I would be concerned about it. Like I would want to know what's inside of me. So
I think this podcast may be kind of frustrating for people too, because we're very much so in the midst of like 25% of the way through this series and this conversation, and we're, you and I talking beforehand, going like, let's not give away, some pieces that need to be unpacked in the context of part 2. And it's hard because we want to like, but I think really unpacking the problem is important because repetition happens by default. We're going to repeat the cycles of behavior that have been shown to us, passed down to us. That's going to happen by default. The designed part is breaking those habits, breaking those behaviors, breaking the generational sin. And we are going to get into that in part 2, 3, and 4. But it's important just to recognize that that's the case. And you can't white knuckle your way out of it. Like the way you were raised, the way you were brought up is ingrained in you. And it's not just a willpower thing. It's something far greater than that.
Absolutely.
I would also add, I've been referencing this a bunch just here on staff, but it's this book called What Happened to You, and just finished going through it, and it was very, very interesting. You can't have a conversation about breaking free from something in life that has a hold on you without making your way back towards trauma. And so what happened to you is all about just trauma and the brain and breaking down what happens in your brain as a result of trauma in your life. And it's just an amazing way of thinking about it, because so often we repeat the cycle of behavior and we go, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And it completely reframes it into, that's the wrong question to ask. The question is not what what's wrong with me. It's what happened to me.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah.
And when I start there, then I can begin to go, oh, because of what happened to me, I learned to operate in a specific way that made sense in my childhood. That's not benefiting me anymore as an adult. I've got to break some behaviors, break some ways of thinking, break some mindsets in order to set myself free. And so I think it's really good. That's a great book if anybody hasn't. It's a great Audible book. It's essentially just Oprah Winfrey, which I was surprised at when this book was recommended to me. I was like, I don't know. I've never listened to anything Oprah related, but she's interviewing a neurobiologist who has studied trauma his whole life. And it is so educational, helpful in kind of breaking down this concept. So I'd highly recommend that one. So let's jump to the last question. You referenced AA step number 1, and this is just really what our hope is for this podcast too, is to go just say there's a problem, identify what it is, say, recognize there is a problem, admit you have a problem. Why is that so hard for us to do?
Well, I think, it's another one with a lot of layers. I think it is, to me, I think the unknown is maybe the biggest. Like to do something different is scary because it's like, as much as what's the saying? It's like better the devil I know than the one I don't, or something like that. It's even though I know this isn't great for me, it's what I know. It's the life I know, and it may not be great, but it's like, man, I do feel better for an hour. I do, and I'm even addicted to the pattern of like feeling some shame, but then remembering I'm forgiven, and so there's to some extent like stepping into the unknown is scary. Sometimes the steps required for like what is different is scary. Like does that admitting something to somebody, talking about sharing something that maybe feels like a secret, or maybe, to like go like and be vulnerable with that. That's terrifying for people a lot of times. Right. So I think that's involved. I do think there's some biology in this, like our brains are just, they're like doing everything they can to make everything a habit to conserve as much energy as possible. And so you've got some habits, like there's just a thing your brain tells you to do when you're tired at the end of the day. And it starts to try to put you in autopilot towards the habit that you don't want to go to. And so there's like some tough, like some of that's just difficult. That's a little bit of the white knuckling, aspect of all of this, of like, not out willpowering it, but understanding like it's going to be hard. So I think all of that is in there, but I think pride, I just, to admit that there's something I can't do is that's difficult for a lot of us. It's scary. We want to be able to control, we want to be able to control the outcomes, and to say that I can't anymore is a very vulnerable, scary place to be. So I think that's in there too. I also think we talk about the voices and where there is this like deceptive lie that's just in our minds. We just got to pay attention to. It's not true that like tomorrow will be different or something. Next Monday will be different. It's a little bit like grass is greener, but it's a little bit like this was the last time. Like if you told yourself that 1,000 times before, it's like, is it? Is it the last time? You know. So that's when I say it's like there's a lot of reasons for it. And some of us just haven't experienced it. Some of us just haven't taken that step. It feels like you're stepping off a cliff or something, and you're like, is it going to be a bridge? Is anybody going to catch me? Is it? Yeah. But taking that step of surrender, of admitting like, man, something has power over me. Like when that's new and raw, that's scary.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, in no way do we want to minimize, anything that people are bumping into or dealing with. I mean, this is a huge step to go, I have a problem with this. And I would say it would be a disservice to yourself, whoever's listening or dealing with something that you're trying to be set free from, to go through this content, in this series and even this podcast, and not have anybody to talk about talk about it. Yeah. I love the quote. I think it's Brene Brown, but I think somebody said it first. It said, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And there are so many layers of how your brain grows character through forming different people groups and what your people do and the values of your people. And if you're not on the other side of a person or a people who are pushing you and encouraging you, and on the other side of you loving you, trying to break free, this doesn't go anywhere. And you have to get on the other side of a person. And so I would just say, if you are listening And maybe you have something you haven't said out loud before to someone. You need someone to talk to. I mean, call our church, call our offices. We would love to meet with you. Go to your small group leader. Go to a trusted friend, someone who exemplifies the values you want to see in yourself, and talk about what's going on. That might be the very first step to admit there's a problem that you need to do in order to seek being set free and experience healing.
Yeah.
And I just think that's so important.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just think for somebody who's never had one of those conversations too, like how often that's actually so honoring when it is like a trusted friend. You know, I think it seems so terrifying, and is this person going to see me different? But like, you know, I think it's honestly so opposite a lot. You're like, hey, this guy on stage yelled at me and told me I had a problem, said I had to talk to somebody about it. So you're the one I trust to say I have this problem. And there's usually the way that's met is there's almost like an intimacy. There's a trust. There's like a man, you've trusted me to be the one to like be vulnerable with.
Yep.
And usually that's a very connective moment. I say usually because certainly sometimes people don't have the tools to respond well, and that's hurtful. And that's why it is vulnerability. That's why, because it can be hurtful. But so often that ends up being a really connective step in a moment. And so,
yeah. And I would say too, on that note, just one of my prayers for the series is people do experience connection as a result. You know, there's greater degrees of connection that happen between people in community groups or something like that, or even just people take a step to go see a counselor. Because sometimes your community group leader and your community group, they love you, they're for you, but whatever you're dealing with, they might not be able to navigate that with you. You 100%. Might need to seek some other help, and that's okay. That is okay to do. I think seeing a counselor is a sign of strength, not weakness. And so that could be the way in which you admit, you know, there's a problem as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
I would just end with this. In my personal time with God, I'm reading that verse kind of over and over again each day right now, that where Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." And perhaps you're listening to this and you've been weary and carried a heavy burden for a while. I just want you to know, and we'll just do that in this moment, and you might be listening to this a year from now, whatever it might be, but we'll just invite Jesus into this and say, you know, we really believe that he's going to give you rest. And where we're going in this series, it's far more about your relationship with him than it is about the relationship with the thing that has a hold on you. And so, Jordan, would you just pray for us and pray for people listening, and just we really want to invite God into this moment?
Yeah, absolutely, man. Father, you're so good to us that you know what's best for us. You've designed us, and you've told us what's best for us as a result, because you love us and you watch us take steps outside of that, and you watch us take steps away from you, and then you just remain there with your arms wide open. You engage us, you pursue us again and again and again, and to have a loving Heavenly Father, that, God, we acknowledge you know us better than we know ourselves, that we can't hide anything from you. You know whatever that stop or start thing is that we're thinking of, you know exactly what it is. You know it more intimately than we do. You know why we do it, and yet you meet us in it. And I just ask that you would allow that truth to sink in, that we feel great peace and comfort and love from that, to know that we're not alone in whatever the struggle is, that God, you walk with us through it, that you're the only one that can heal what needs to be healed. You're the only one that can comfort what needs to be comforted ultimately. And would you just lend us an awareness of your strength and your presence, and how for us you are, and how much of a loving Father you are, that you really are trustworthy to come to these things and have real honest conversations about. And like Jeremy just said, would we experience the lightness of that burden, experience the lightness of you, the peace that comes from surrendering to you and just saying we can't keep struggling with the things we've been fighting on our own, Father, but we willingly hand them to you. And we're so grateful to know that we can do that, and you're with us in all of those processes. And Father, we love you. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jordan. For those of you who are listening, I would really encourage you guys, make sure to listen to part 2 and 3 and 4 and all the Overtime podcasts that go along with it, as this is one big, long conversation about what it looks like to be set free. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in person or live online Sunday, 9:30 and 11. Thanks, y'all.